Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deck overview, this time with Gruul Bushwhacker in the format. If you like these informative deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and letting me know what deck overview you might like to see next. Now, this is a deck that has, in some form or other, existed in the format, or at least the capability of it, and that is a Burning Tree Gruul-based aggressive deck. This is the first time that a Gruul aggressive deck has popped up that has been really centered around Goblin Bushwhacker and Atarka's Command. Previously, when Gruul was a thing in the format, before when Oda took over and all that, and then when it was banning, Gruul was usually like a one-drop elf into 3-drop creature into collect a company kind of deck, really relying on the power of things like Goblin Rabble Master, Legion War Boss, kind of taking over the game from there. Also using powerful things like Gruul, the 3-mana 3/3 haste or riot creature. Basically, it had a whole bunch of powerful 3-drops and really kind of eschewed the 2-drop slot. And then use the elves to get that extra little bit of boost. This one instead kind of plays like a mono red deck that is more in on creatures than spells. So to start out, you're using things like Soulscar Mage, Monastery Swift Spear, things you kind of expect to see in Kamano Faces Kakazan, things you kind of expect to see in a mono red aggressive deck. Where it starts to go a little bit weird is in the 2-drop slot that we'll talk about in a minute, but the deck has a couple new additions. Phoenix Chick, which is a 1/1 hasty flyer, that whenever you're attacking with 3 creatures, you can pay double red to get it back from the graveyard to get a +1/+1 counter on it. And then you have a My Iconoclast, which is a 3/2 creature that you can pay a kicker to give it haste and +1/+1 until end of turn. And this kind of gives you yet another hasty threat to close out the game. Another key thing in this deck is Legion Loyalist, which makes blocking with tokens kind of useless and also makes combat a lot more difficult for the opponent, because whenever Battalion triggers, whenever it attacks with 2 or more creatures, your creatures gain first strike and trample, and they can't be blocked with tokens. This is relevant most notably against mono green when they have to play wolf tokens and bring back copies of Old Growth Troll. But the one that's even more important against is against Abzan Greasefang, because a lot of times if they don't have their A game, their main game plan is to chump block with things like Satyr Wayfinder or Rafine's Informant or tokens from Asika's Chariot, and this kind of nullifies that strategy and helps you get them dead. And overall, like I said, makes blocking a little bit more difficult. Beyond that, you have a little bit of creature removal in the form of things with Play with Fire, but the main thing of this deck is Burning Tree into broken dumb plays. You can have Burning Tree and Akari Zeb, put a lot of power on the battlefield on turn 2, kind of go nuts from there. You can also have Burning Tree into Goblin Bushwhacker Kicked, hit your opponent for a bunch of damage on turn 2 or turn 3. And then when you're going wide with all of these various creatures, you may as well play something like Atarka's Command that pumps all your creatures, keeps your opponent from getting life, or just deals 3 damage to them. And then, you're playing a 2-color mana base. Another thing that makes this deck a little bit more reasonable is the recent printing of Carpolucent Forest into the format. And then, you still get to play powerful man lands like Dun of the Bugbear to hopefully close out the game. The sideboard, you're looking for tools against certain matchups. Rending Volley primarily here against Greasefang and Mono White Humans. Hazoret kind of here for the grindy kind of matchups, along with Squee when you're expecting to face a bunch of removal spells from your opponent. Things like Rakdos or Blue-White Control, you might bring these in just to have resilient threats that are difficult for them to deal with. Akari Zeb's Expertise when you need to steal big dumb idiots, such as against Mono Green, to kill them. Bone Crusher Giant as kind of this pseudo, I guess we forgot to cover it in the main deck, this kind of pseudo removal spell, splash big body that can kill a bunch of things. Lava Coil kills a bunch of creatures that you want to kill, especially things like Old Growth Troll and such. Then Strangle just as another removal spell to kind of clear the way, as really the big thing is you want to keep the board clear and kill your opponent as quickly as possible. You're not really a burn deck, you're more of a zoo-esque deck trying to run your opponent out of the game. Taking a look at another slightly different version, see things like Zergo Bellstriker. There's been some other 1-drops that you'll occasionally see play. But these are the main ones that have been popping up. Zergo, Monastery Swift Spear, Kamano, Foundry Street Denizen, another one that plays off quite nicely with all these creatures into play. It gets +1/+0 for each creature that enters the battlefield under your control. If you're like going Foundry Street Denizen into Burning Tree Emissary into Rakdos Bushwhacker, you're doming your opponent for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on turn 2. This deck is capable of some crazy starts, but it does have some problems that we'll talk about here in a minute. But main deck, mainly the same, still playing about 20 lands. This is a deck that could be prone to flooding out, and it's very important that you keep a low land count while also, keeping the pressure on the opponent in the early turns. Destructive Revelry is an interesting card. Gives you outs to annoying things like Sky Sovereign and such out of the Karn decks, mono green, etc. Maybe blow up their early mana ramp. Also relevant against the vehicles out of Abzan Greasefang, buying you that important turn to close out the game. Eidolon when you're up against some type of spell-based deck, just dealing them a little bit of extra damage. Roast when you need an even bigger removal spell than Lava Coil, but don't necessarily care about the exiling effect. Running Volley, we've already kind of talked about being important against humans and Greasefang in particular. Squee, obviously a nice resilient threat that forces your opponent to deal with it over and over again. And then Strangle, once again, when you need efficient removal spells to remove your opponent's creatures from the battlefield. 3 toughness or greater, so, okay against Rakdos and such. Can come in against mono green, kill their early mana dorks. Just kind of get their stuff out of the way. That kind of thing. Coming in against humans when you need a little bit more resiliency and you need to be a little bit more of the control deck, especially on the draw. These kind of strategies are very explosive. Obviously, they can run down combo decks. Decks like Lotus Field combo, even early turns from mono green. If they have a more planeswalker or mana dork heavy start, these decks can really kind of run them over. Where they tend to run into problems is against decks with a plethora of removal and big bodies. So first up, Rakdos. Kind of the deck that every creature deck has to ask itself its question: what's your answer to the Rakdos matchup? Generally, the answer is I die. But beyond that, you generally play more resilient threats. Things like Squee to put pressure on the opponent, Hazoret, things like Experimental Frenzy. These cards that just threaten to try to keep up with Rakdos for a couple of turns to allow you to get you over the hump after you get that initial wave of damage in. Decks like Izzet Phoenix would be a little bit rough for this deck. Although Izzet doesn't have nearly the board presence that something like Rakdos does, but Thing in the Ice backed up by a bunch of removal spells, or a quick big Ledger Shredder backed up by some removal spells could be some problematic. But obviously Izzet Phoenix has kind of fallen off in the face of Rakdos' growing superiority as the mid-range deck of choice. Beyond that, you put a lot of early pressure on blue-white control, force them to have a sweeper. Then if you have like some type of follow-up, like say Burning Tree into Bushwhacker after they've dealt with your board on turn 4, maybe rebuying a Phoenix Chick in the process. And you have some amount of resiliency and some amount of haste that can give a deck like blue-white control a lot of problems in the early turns, especially if you can close out the game. The rest of the format basically boils down to you're a very good gold fishing deck, but how much interaction does your opponent have? How quickly can they execute their strategy? So, a deck like Mono White Humans could potentially clog up the board, but, they sometimes have some clunky draws where like a removal spell or two can get you there. You look at decks like Spirits, this deck probably does quite well into that, as Spirits is a little bit less efficient, and this deck has just enough removal spells to keep the Spirits decks in check. And so, you're kind of looking at a deck that has a fairly good matchup against the field, except Rakdos, and Rakdos is the aggro killer. So it's a deck that's started to put up some results and something you should be aware of. And it's a blast to play with. The deck has some truly fantastic explosive draws, but it also has some real clunkers where you say mulligan to 6 and have like 3 lands, Swift Spear, Akari Zev, Bushwhacker, which seems like a good hand, but your opponent can easily 1-for-1 that into the ground. And, you can't really afford to mulligan too low with these decks because they are kind of a critical mass aggressive deck. But, this is a deck that is capable of some insane things, capable of some good results. And if you can get a little bit lucky against Rakdos, you can definitely put up some good results with this deck. I've played some very similar decks in Modern in my day, and these decks were explosive and silly before Modern got overly removal centric, and just creature decks really struggle unless they're more towards the resilient side than the the hyper aggressive side. So it's a deck that can have a lot of fun, and decks that can certainly put up results. And it's good to see Gruul kind of getting back in the format as a deck that is playable. So, as always, if you like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. And maybe let me know what deck you'd like to see us cover next.